Good afternoon. Welcome to the fifth and final session in the MCIE and Brooks Publishing Inclusive Early Childhood Education Online Training Series. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Barb Gruber from MCIE, and I will be your facilitator for the session. During the session, I want to remind you that you'll be muted. You can type questions in the chat window, and they'll be answered as they come up or at the end of the session. And also, by joining us today, you will hear this live session and have an opportunity to ask the presenter questions. And we haven't had many questions being asked, so please feel free since this is our last one. You'll also be receiving a copy of the presenter's book if you haven't already gotten that, and a certificate of attendance and the link of for today's session. And today's session is Keras Kit for Toddlers, Creating Adaptations for Routines and Activities with Suzanne Milbourne. Suzanne is the director for the Delaware Early Childhood Assistive Technology Demonstration, which is a 5-year federally funded project awarded in January of 2013 to the University of Delaware's Center for Disability Studies. She is the co-author of the highly regarded Keras Kit for Preschoolers, which came out in 2007, and its companion 2012 toddler version, which she's going to talk about today. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Suzanne. Let me get your slides up.
Thanks, Barb, and welcome, everyone. As Barb said, we'll have time at the end for question and answer, and if nobody has questions, I have a set of questions that we often get asked and can certainly dive into some of those if we have the time. So, whoa,
okay,
there we go.
Sorry, I just put you back. I'm sorry, I put you there. Okay, sorry.
That's great. No. Okay, so Keras Kit for Toddlers. This is our 2012 release that was published by Brooks, and we want to thank the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education and also Brooks for supporting this opportunity to share information with you today. Please don't pay attention to the number of slides because some of you may or may not see the number, but we're going to go through a journey together today, and that journey is going to start like this. First, we're going to lay you a foundation and a basic understanding of some of the premises or the groundwork that is behind the Keras Kit and the context in which Keras Kit fits in the larger scheme of early childhood education and special education. We're going to walk through the actual kit and provide you with a breakdown of sort of the components and the parts of the schematic, if you will, of the Keras Kit. And hopefully we will get you started out writing. I'll talk a little bit later about how using Keras Kit is similar to riding a bike, and hopefully we can get you to ride that bike with us through this journey. And we're going to send you away from this webinar hopefully with a basic understanding that's enough that you can pick up the Keras Kit and be off on your individual journeys to use it in your practice. And, you know, once you start getting your hands on it and using the Keras Kit, you have the opportunity to outreach to me for further discussion. So let's start with a foundation and give you some context for the Keras Kit just so you have some background. There was a 2009 position statement that came out jointly from the NAEYC and the DEC professional organizations. Some of you may be familiar with this, but there's 3 topic areas that are emphasized in that position statement, all having to do with inclusion. So it's access, participation, and support. And if we can provide these 3 components through programming for young children with disabilities, then we feel like we can have successful inclusion. I don't know if you've talked about these concepts in your other webinars, but today we're going to focus on, and Keras Kit really finds its place when we talk about participation. And so when you're thinking about Keras Kit and the ultimate use of it, it really focuses on this idea that participation needs to be supported, and we need to be intentional about the way we plan for children's participation. The other sort of contextual factor behind this is the DEC recommended practices, which recently was released in 2014. And in the DEC recommended practices, they talk about teaching practices. And if we think about teaching practices the way that DEC describes it, there's really sort of two camps, if you will. And teaching practices becomes an umbrella term that's used to describe what professionals do to help children participate in activities and routines, and in doing so, they learn new skills. So, Barb, I'm hearing feedback. I want to just check in and make sure no one else is hearing it.
I'm not hearing it.
Okay.
If anybody's getting it, they can. I don't see anything in the chat window. That's usually where we see that.
So I'll just try to ignore my own self. Okay. So
they're typing up now. They are getting some.
Should I continue to roll while you're problem solving, or?
It must be on your end. So yeah, just keep going. You're clear to me.
Okay, I'm going to move my phone away from the computer. Maybe that'll help. Okay, so these teaching practices, as I said, this is an umbrella term. And when we think about instructional practices, the instructional practices as presented by DEC and others include the what, when, and how to evaluate the effects of direct instruction, and how to promote and evaluate the quality of instruction provided by others. So this is where we focus on the hands-on instructional component and evaluating the skills and the knowledge that children acquire over time. When we think about environmental practices, this is where we refer to aspects of the space, the materials, the equipment, routines, and the activities that we might intentionally alter to support young children's learning. And this environmental practices encompasses both structural, so space, equipment, materials, but also social, the interactions with peers, siblings, and family members in the variety of environments where instructional practices create more learning opportunities without referencing a specific learning context. So be thinking of these two camps, and I'm going to show you a different kind of way, a model rather than text for thinking about this. So when we think about these instructional practices, basically what we're all familiar with is assessing children's skill performance, if you start at the top, identifying child goals based on skill deficits, using instructional practices to address those skill deficit areas, and then tracking progress of performance over time. This is a pretty common cycle. This is a very generic way of describing it, but it's a pretty common cycle of instructional practices. Parallel to that is this concept of environmental practices, and here, starting at the top, we see that environmental practices starts with assessing activities and routines, and then identifying which of those activities and routines are not working well, and using environmental practices and tracking changes in a child's participation over time. So when you put these two approaches together, we find that this more comprehensive approach in terms of addressing not only skill performance, but addressing activities and routines results in very positive outcomes for young children. We recently published this information in an article that I'll show to you in a minute. But basically, the environmental-based practices approach would state that the environmental-based practices approach is as important as instructional interventions. It's as important as focusing on skill development. It considers how learning situations affect children's participation in routines and activities, and that's just as important as the what happens in terms of their learning. It requires a flexible and evolving process that weaves together information about both the individual children and the environments, the multiple environments in which they participate. And environmental-based practices can serve as a bridge or a mediator between the skills that a child currently performs or lacks and the requirements of particular environmental situations. It also can make things easier, convenient for a variety of children without disabilities, but for a child with a disability or a developmental delay, environmental-based practices may be the difference between being able to participate in an activity or a routine or not, And also consider that knowing about a child's daily routines is just as important as knowing about the targeted skills, and also knowing the expectations and the level of satisfaction of the caretaker or the caregiver is just as important about knowing daily routines and activities. Now, all of this is laid out in more detail, and I don't expect you to memorize it, of course, but just to give you some foundation as to where CARES Kit fits into the scheme of teaching practices. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and show you the inside of the kit. And having this background will help you understand how the kit is intended to be used. But again, you can read more about environmental-based practices. It was recently published in a YEC monograph number 16. Pip Campbell is the co-author on that, and the title is Together is Better. And I understand that Brooks has been doing a pretty good job at marketing that, so maybe some of you have received information about that monograph, but that is available and talks specifically about this concept. So the other thing I want to give you some foundation for is, where does CARES Kit fit into this larger picture of thinking about making accommodations for young children with disabilities and developmental delays? We adopted this sort of tier approach, if you will, similar to the RTI framework, Response to Intervention Framework. Some of you are probably familiar with that. But in our case, we're focused on the environmental components, and they really focus on tier 1 being an approach using universal design and universal design for learning. Tier 2 is adaptations to things like the environment, schedule, activities, and materials. And tier 3 of this perspective, and I'm going to keep building this so you have a framework, tier 3 is the customized and specialized technologies that some children might need in order to be successful in inclusive environments. We talk about the tiers as being most to least restrictive in terms of how it's presented to those who need to implement the environmental-based practices with young children. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in terms of the concept of most to least restrictive when we get inside the CARES Kit. But to know that the process that we saw in the previous diagram, assessing activities and routines, identifying those that are not working well, using environmental practices and tracking changes in participation, that's the cycle that would be used at any one of these tiers if you're introducing either concepts of universal design for learning, adaptations, or specialized or customized technologies. Now, CARES Kit, so this is pretty comprehensive, but CARES Kit fits at this tier 2 level. And tier 2 is intended to be things that clinicians, teachers, educators, special educators, anyone should be able to make these considerations and should be able to put them in place in terms of creating adaptations for young children. And what we came to discover over our many years of working in the field, in classrooms with young children, was that teachers appeared and clinicians appeared to at times be creating adaptations, but there really was a lack of intentionality or a process that they could follow to really put this into practice on an everyday basis. So this is one of the reasons that we packaged the CARES Kit the way we did. And so what I want to share with you is sort of the inside of the CARES Kit and let you know what's packaged in there so that you can adopt this very intentional approach of using environment-based practices in your everyday work that you're doing in the community. So welcome to CARES Kit. We're going to go through sort of the schematic and the pieces and parts a little bit to give you some lay the groundwork for what's in the kit. And I'm going to stress a couple things along the way in terms of the importance behind using CARES Kit. But for those who don't know, and sometimes I get emailed this question, what does CARA stand for? CARA stands for Creating Adaptations for Routines and Activities. The voice of CARES Kit is a teacher. Her name is Kara. We thought we were very creative in designing that, but we often find that people don't understand that it is an acronym, and it stands for this Creating Adaptations for Routines and Activities. And it was intended to help individuals who care for children on a regular basis or provide interventions to children on a regular basis to use adaptations and promote children's participation in routines and activities throughout the day. So participation, as I said earlier, is really a key feature of the outcome of CARES Kit. And I want to just reemphasize this, that CARES Kit is not intended to directly have an effect on children's skills or skill development, but rather indirectly provide multiple learning opportunities across the day where children can participate, and by virtue of that, or incidentally, learning happens. So I just want to make that real clear, because a lot of people like to pick up things that will help them teach children skills, and in this case, CARES Kit is really focused on promoting participation in everyday routines and activities, which by virtue of doing so creates the foundation for learning and development. So this concept of adaptations, another piece of the CARES Kit, is that it's good to recognize that it's not intended only for children with disabilities or developmental delays, but it's really a tool that can be used to help children in particular situations or improve across a group situation the routines and activities that are not working well. So it can be used with children with disabilities by far. It's helped many children that we know with disabilities be successful and be able to participate, but it also is a tool that can be applied to any and all children in the environments that you work in. So adaptations themselves, one thing to stress about adaptations is, again, that we are focused on participation in everyday routines and activities if we're able to very intentionally think about what we need to adapt or what we want to try and adapt. And we're going to walk through some examples of various areas or levels, if you will, that can be adapted. And CARES Kit is very intentional about walking through each of these areas so that you can maximize the outcomes by using adaptations, the outcomes of children's participation. So how do they work? So we understand that environment, basically our physical environment and our social environment, shapes behavior. And we only can be as successful as we can in knowing what we want a situation to look like. So part of using CARES Kit is having and creating a vision for what we want a situation, perhaps an activity or a routine that's not working well. We need to create a clear vision of what we want that situation to look like in order to understand how to put adaptations to work for us. We find that the more specific a person can be in describing how they want a situation to look, the more opportunity we have for the introduction of a variety of adaptations across multiple levels. And we're going to get into that in a second. But the concept is that, you know, there's this exchange between the environment and a child's behavior, and we can capitalize on using the environment to shape behavior, in addition to using the instructional strategies that we discussed earlier. So again, another concept is that when we think about the use of adaptations, we want to be thinking of things that can help support children across a variety of settings. So not only in the classroom, but outside in the community and also at home with the family. So the things we put in place in one environment should seamlessly transition to another environment, another concept in the kit. And again, if we can increase the number of learning opportunities that we support by using adaptations, of course, we open up a multitude of ways that children can learn. And if we don't use adaptations, in a lot of cases, it reduces those learning opportunities. The idea here is that the adaptations serve as sort of the third hand, if you will. We would go into many classrooms where we would say, so what is going to help you be able to support this child? And in many cases, people said, we need extra hands. We need another person. And we say, okay, let's think about very intentionally things we can change, since in most cases we can't add another person, although that would be nice. Are there other ways that we can address this situation so that we can promote participation before we attempt in any way to bring in another adult to intervene or to assist. So the intervention at the adult level is saved or reserved for instances where that is pretty obviously needed. And we're going to hopefully walk you through a process today that will help you see that using adaptations can serve indeed as that third hand. And we've had great success in helping people use this in multiple settings. So in the kit, there's a presentation, a little discussion about this adaptations hierarchy. And here again, we see this concept of least intrusive to most intrusive. And the goal with CARES Kit is really to start at the top of this list and use what we consider least intrusive environmental practices. So if we start from the bottom for discussion purposes, if I were to be working with you as a consultant and coming into your environment, it would be much more intrusive for me to suggest that you as the adult caring for the child or teaching the child need to change your own behavior and need to change the actions you're taking so that we can better provide opportunities for learning for this child. That's pretty intrusive to ask an adult to change their own behavior patterns or to change the actions they take. So the opposite of that is to say, let's think about how this environment can support the child and work with you to make considerations for things like room arrangement or the types of equipment that you're using and so on and so forth. We found that that was much more acceptable to the teachers and the clinicians that we were working with, that people were more willing to try to make changes to the structure within the environment versus making changes to their own behaviors. And so we're not saying that you try one level and then you skip to the next level if things don't work, but you want to use adaptations across a variety of these levels of the hierarchy in combination with reservation on the things that require really adults to change their behavior. We have found actually that if we can institute things at the environment level, adaptations at the schedule level, adaptations at the third and fourth levels, that by virtue of that, the adult behavior actually might change without the adult really having a conscious awareness of those changes coming about. So let's walk through this hierarchy. I'm going to give you a few highlights about each level and show you some photographs that represent some things that you might start to consider. And then once we get through the hierarchy, I'm going to talk you through the 6 basic steps of the CARES Kit that is sort of the action part. So this is, again, the structure of the kit, how it's laid out, what the content is, or what you would find if you were to look at the kit. And then we'll focus on, so what do you do with it, piece next. So let's start with the environment. A lot of us in the early childhood community study and learn a lot about environment and how it affects children's behavior. So again, you know, we're not bringing probably anything new to the table in terms of thinking about environment, although we may provide some examples that you say, I never thought of that. But what we're trying to create is an intentional way of thinking about and addressing an individual child's needs for particular routines and activities, starting with this idea of the environment. So here are some things within the environment that we can certainly consider. Room arrangement being number one. We all know that room arrangement speaks a lot to children and indicates the expectations of children during a particular time of the day. We know that environments contain a lot of furniture and equipment that children are using and that the adults are using throughout the day. But we also want to think about lighting. We also want to consider how sound is impacting behavior. And aroma, which is one of my favorites, which we often don't consider in the early childhood community. And then color and ambiance, which has a lot of research behind it that I think we neglect to consider in the early childhood community, at least in my experience in some of the settings that I've been in. But let's look at some examples. So here's an example of a room arrangement that for some children might be very acceptable. But for certain children, perhaps with mobility issues or visual impairments, this type of setting might be too cluttered, too clustered, too contained, and we might need to reconsider room arrangements for particular children who enter into this environment. Here's an environment that's set up very appropriately for many children to access. I always say to teachers, I envy this block area. This is a wonderful area for play for multiple children. It's very clear. It's not cluttered, clear in terms of the expectations of what is to be utilized within this rugged area, which is so nicely vacuumed for this photograph. But very clear expectations. Layout allows multiple children with multiple movement abilities to access this environment. And compared to the other, the former picture up there, not much would have to be done to this particular block area to accommodate a variety of children. Okay, so room arrangement, something you're probably all very familiar with. Furniture and equipment, this is where it gets a little bit different when we talk about children with physical disabilities. This is a child with pretty significant cerebral palsy. She is in her Rifton chair. This chair was very expensive. It does grow with the child over time. The thing about this chair, it became a great attraction in her classroom. Every other child who was in her group wanted to take a turn to be in this chair. But as you can see, this piece of equipment clearly identifies that this child is different in a lot of ways from the other children in the classroom. So when we talk about equipment, there's a couple things to consider. Number one, is it absolutely necessary to introduce the very specialized equipment into a classroom setting? If the answer is yes, then what we want to secondly consider is, can we introduce a variety of ways that children can sit when they're participating in sitting activities? So, and I'm not suggesting that we buy specialized equipment for every child, but what I'm suggesting is that we have options. So not only do we have little chairs at the tables, but for circle time we might introduce balls to sit on or boxes to sit in or pillows or other options so that children can see that there are a variety of ways and we don't all have to be in the same type of sitting positions all the time. The other thing to think about with the equipment is it not only has to support the child, but it doesn't have to look like equipment. This is the same child in the back of a wagon, and her mother was so attuned to her sitting needs that she simply introduced this concept of a laundry basket, 2 rolls of paper towels, and she actually has a really nice cushy plush kind of blanket under her as well, but meeting the same outcome. Having this child be able to participate, that's her twin sister sitting in front of her, being able to participate in a sitting and, in this case, mobility routine with the wagon, but at a very low cost. And we would consider this equipment for this particular child to meet her particular needs. So be thinking broadly and uniquely and creatively about what it means when we talk about equipment and furniture. Lighting, again, you're all probably familiar with this concept. Most of our early childhood settings have overhead fluorescent lighting. We want to make sure that there are options to provide lighting access in a variety of ways, whether it's in general for children to have that experience or in particular for children with visual impairments or other needs in terms of responding to lighting, whether it's the stimulus from the lighting, the audio projections that come from certain lighting sources, so on and so forth, another consideration. And then having sound absorbent materials, something as easy as, you know, putting tennis balls or these, what are these, I can't ask you for help because you can't talk to me, but you know what this is on this, felting, thank you, felting on the bottom of chairs to reduce the amount of sound screeching chairs, which is one of my pet peeves, and I find that once teachers realize that they can reduce that noise level, it really helps in certain classrooms. And also, you're all familiar with sound-absorbent materials that are introduced into most early childhood settings, the soft things that we're all rated on in the early childhood rating scales. You know, do you have a soft area, which includes a rug, a soft place to sit, pillows, so on and so forth. But this is really important when we start to think about children with disabilities who are very overwhelmed or triggered by loud, noisy, hard environments. And then there's aroma. There's lots of ways we can introduce aroma in non-toxic ways into classroom environments for toddlers and for preschoolers. And we found that doing this through non-toxic soaps and also through having a variety of non-toxic herbs and whatnot in the classroom can bring about a sense of aroma. Now, you're saying, oh my goodness, so what does this have to do with promoting participation? But you know as well as I do that certain aromas stimulate certain types of reactions. So there's stimulating aromas and there's calming aromas. And if we start to think about how to systematically introducing them into the classroom environment, we've seen that it has a significant impact on children's behavior. So this concept of aroma is something new to some of us in terms of using it for classroom settings or for early childhood type settings, but it's something we often do for ourselves individually, but we don't transfer. So just keep that in mind. And of course, color is another aspect of the environment that we need to consider, and there's a lot of research that we can read about in terms of stimulating colors, calming colors, how to create a neutral environment and introduce colors in a way that's changeable and flexible over time. So I just ran through very quickly some of the highlights of thinking about environment, and again, environment being the sort of top of the hierarchy with regards to this least intrusive concept. So the next level of the hierarchy is the schedule. And here are some things that we need to consider as we ask that be considered about the schedule, the sequence of the schedule, the time of day when a schedule is discussed. Is it only discussed once in the day or presented once in the day or multiple times in the day? How is it presented in terms of days of the week? Is it change every day? Is it the same every day? Is there some level of consistency and some level of flexibility built into each day? How are children accessing the schedule? Is it through just auditory? Is it through letters? Is it through pictures? Is it through touch? And then being responsive as possible to the interests and the desires and the needs of the children in a particular group. So these are just 5 things that we ask be considered for schedule. And we know that everyone in the early childhood community has been introduced at some point to visual supports, and we see visual supports as an adaptation that can be introduced in terms of supporting children's participation in scheduled routines and activities. So you're familiar with, schedules that look like this that have to do with helping children participate in feelings across the day during particular routines and activities, that helping children comprehend their understanding of how they enjoy or what they are fearful of or things of that nature with regards to the scheduled routines and activities. Having daily schedules that can be manipulated by the children and reordered in some fashion over time if necessary to adjust for children's need for flexibility. Giving picture awareness so that, using pictures of children in the group so they can see what is expected of them for a particular time of day. And then individual schedules. This happens to be one, it's an individual schedule for a child in preparing to go see the doctor. And so this was an individual schedule of how do I get ready to go to this doctor's visit? And you could transfer this concept into a classroom, getting ready for a particular activity or a particular routine. So just some examples of adaptations to the schedule. We also have the hierarchy where we talk about adaptations to activities and routines. I'm going to run through some, descriptors here. We want to think about the length of the activity, the location, the roles that children are expected to play in the activity, the number of children that are grouped for activities. Are we intentionally selecting particular children to be paired together or grouped together for particular activities and routines? And do we have expectations that are individualized for particular children or for all of the children in your group? Those are things we need to think about. Temporal. How does one act in chunks across the course of the day, and children learn how to stop and restart, and how to indicate that they need to stop and restart if necessary for particular routines and activities. And then the all-time favorite, we're moving down in the hierarchy, so we went through environment, schedule, routines and activities. Materials is something that most people capture and think is the most fun in terms of creating adaptations because it's all the stuff. It's all the stuff that we use in the early childhood environment. it's recycled stuff. It doesn't have to be expensive stuff. This is a fruit tray, styrofoam fruit tray that was bought probably at a supermarket, had fruit on it at one time. We scour it, we clean it, and then we can use it by slicing a little, knife through it. We can create a card holder. It becomes one of the best ways we can help children handle things that they can't handle in their hands. Taking all kinds of objects and adapting them so that children can participate and be more successful. I'll just tell you a very quick story. The top left-hand corner is a little matchbox car, and what is attached to it is a clothespin, and in the clothespin is a blue crayon. And oftentimes when we think about adapting materials, we often think about children with physical disabilities or physical needs. But in this particular story, this was a child where we adapted the materials to entice them to be interested in using writing implements. This was a child who loved Matchbox cars and loved to play with them all the time, all day long, and was very hard to refocus in learning new opportunities for expressing himself through writing or to, do some creative drawing and things of that nature. So we simply said, we need to take advantage of his interest in the Matchbox car. We're going to adapt it. So we not only adapted the car, we adapted the car with the writing implement. We adapted the environment. We laid down on the floor a variety of paper. We tried a variety of things. We ended up using the kind of rolled paper that you see can be rolled out in big chunks. Usually it's used for finger painting or for making footprints in paint, things like that. Anyway, this child laid on the floor, played with his Matchbox, finally discovered after a series of events using this particular object that he was actually making a mark on the paper. And once he got that idea, he was intrigued and he became motivated to try to create more lines. So we made multiple Matchbox cars with multiple colors of crayons, and eventually this child was moved up to using a crayon so he could begin to express himself on paper, which otherwise may never have evolved until someone sort of did hand over hand. So not only are materials intended to be adapted for children with physical disabilities, but also as a way to engage and to introduce children perhaps to new concepts or new ways that they can interact with the environment. And then the bottom of the hierarchy, and I'm moving through this very quickly, but I want you to have a comprehensive understanding of this approach. The bottom of the hierarchy is the most intrusive, which is the requirements and instructions that we would ask the adults to modify or to adapt during the routines and activities throughout the day. So example, rather than just verbally describing the steps of an activity, use the photographs with children so that they have a visualization of where they're expected to end up at the end of the activity. Instead of the adult being the leader of all the responsibilities of an activity, assign children leadership responsibilities and let them take over for structuring and planning. Now that's a little bit more challenging with toddlers. Preschoolers, you can start to introduce that concept. You just have to scaffold the opportunity for them so they can be successful. Requirements and instructions, the other thing we've done is by virtue of changing the environment, changing the schedule, changing the activity or the routine itself, and then maybe also by changing materials. As I said earlier, we often find that teachers discover that their own behaviors change and they actually start to adjust the way that they're instructing children or the requirements that they have and not even really being conscious of it. And we help them recognize that through a reflection process. That's not specific to CARES-Kit, but it brings me to a point to remind me to say that the CARES-Kit is intended for teachers, clinicians, anybody working with children. There's also a piece in the CARES-Kit that is intended for consultants, and those would be itinerant teachers, therapists, anybody coming in, quality improvement specialists, people coming in to help the adults who are caring for children to do their job better or to better support a child in a particular environment. There's a CD in the back of the CARES-Kit The CARES Kit, if you haven't seen it, it's a pretty small package, but in the back is a pretty robust CD that has materials that you want to make sure you take a look at. And the consultant guide is on there. And there's other things which I'm going to mention in a few minutes. But the requirements and instructions kind of comes about if we let other things happen at the other levels of the adaptations hierarchy. So again, adult assistance is the last resort. Of course, we need to provide it under certain circumstances, but in all circumstances, it may not be necessary. And if we can start by using this very intentional approach of the hierarchy, then we can, by virtue of doing so, stay away from fixing situations and then not really enhancing the learning opportunities. You know, sometimes we see children with adults that are attached to them for, you know, the course of the day, and in some cases we see that that interferes with the ability for the child to engage in learning opportunities because the adult is always doing hands over hand for the child. So just keep this in mind that we're not saying don't do it at all, but if you're using the CARES Kit approach and you're thinking about environmental-based practices, the adult assistance is something that we want you to step back and say, do we really need that? Is there another way that we can approach this situation? So let's give you a kickstart, see if we can teach you how to ride this bike called CARES Kit. And, you know, a lot of what you'll see in CARES Kit is pretty commonsensical to most early childhood folks. And again, it's just that we've provided a very intentional way of using adaptations and thinking about what the goal is. So the goal, as we said earlier, is to really think about what needs to happen or what you would like to see happen and make the adaptations to achieve that result. There's 6 steps in CARES Kit, and I think I actually have 7 here, but I think I split one into 2. But basically, what we need to start with is understanding the situation. And again, it's really not about what is the child doing or not doing in terms of their skill, but it's really about understanding the routines and the activities and what's working and not working. So in CARES Kit, there is a form. It's a very short form that the caretaker, whether it's a family member or a teacher or whoever it is, would complete this form, and it becomes the starting point for thinking about which activities and routines would be the best suited to introduce this idea of adaptations. And knowing that maybe they're the routines and the activities where there are many challenges with children's learning, teachers' opportunity to teach, whatever the case may be. But the whole idea is that if we can discover which activities and routines are not going well, and we can target them for the introduction of adaptations, ultimately, if we can improve those activities and routines by the use of adaptations, we've opened up a wealth of opportunity for learning on the child's behalf. I walked into a classroom many years ago, and I said after some conversation, said to the teacher, this was before we had CARES Kit, I said to the teacher, so when exactly does this challenge or this behavior occur? And she kind of tugged at her hair and she said, you know, it just happens all day long. And that's a very hard place to start because sometimes that's how we feel, that whatever the situation is, it feels like it happens all the time. But what we discovered by developing CARES Kit is if we can nail down 1 or 2 activities or routines where things are not working well, that's a really good starting point. And the ultimate goal is to improve that whole situation. So the second step, once you understand and once you fill out the form that's in CARES Kit on the CD, you have to decide what you want to see happen. This is where you create your vision. So in CARES Kit, there's a series of prompting questions to help you create that vision, which will then lead to helping you consider the variety of adaptations that can be put in place. In the CARES Kit, and I'll show you in 1 second, in the CARES Kit we have matrices, and those matrices include a variety of situations that we collected over many years that teachers and educators told us were the primary things that they dealt with in classrooms and where adaptations would be most useful. And so we've created these matrices based on these scenarios, and we give a wealth of adaptation starter points to think about, and I'll show you that in a minute. But considering is the next step so that you can then select. And the selection of the adaptations, again, I'll give you some examples of what that might look like, but the selection is really a process of talking to a variety of people and gathering information about what might be available or kind of what people envision in terms of the adaptations that could be made. And then, of course, under any circumstances where you're trying to implement something, the next step is to plan. And this is where you get into the nitty-gritty details of who, what, why, when, where, and kind of pulling things together so that everybody who's involved has a plan of action so that you can implement and try, which is the next step, try the adaptations. And what we've discovered through the work that we did is if you can try it for 1 to 2 weeks, you're either going to know immediately if it works, and by the end of about 1 or 2 weeks, you're going to know if it's not working. But if it's not working right away, that doesn't mean it won't work after a trial period of 1 to 2 weeks. So we suggest in Kara's Kit that you try it out for 1 to 2 weeks. And then this is the step that I don't think is very clear in Kara's Kit. This is, Kara's Kit for us is something that's ever evolving. We're continuing to have discussions about how to modify it or introduce new ideas to it. But this assessment piece is really important. You have to go back to what was the understanding? What were the routines and activities we were attempting to adapt? What did we decide did we want to see happen? And have we reached that goal? You need to assess that. And there's no particular form or there's no particular formula in Kara's Kit for that right now, but it's a part of the process, and we do describe in Kara's Kit that that's a piece that needs to be completed. But so in all of the 6 steps, there's really 2 pieces of documentation. One at the understand level, or the first step, where you identify the routines and activities, and the other is at the select level, where you create a document that says, here are the variety of adaptations that we are going to introduce and trial over this 1 to 2 week period. So that's basically a wrap-up on the 6 steps. Remember that this is an ongoing process. Here in the cycle, the arrow keeps going. And as children learn and develop, and as the environment changes and the expectations change, this is really an ongoing process of discovery, and it should include the widest variety of people who are involved in that child's life. Because remember, we said earlier that whatever adaptations we put into action for one environment or one setting should be able to be transferred across settings. So the more people we have involved to generate ideas, the more application is likely across settings. This is an example of one of the matrices that is in Kara's Kit. If you open the booklet of Kara's Kit, you will see one example. I think it's the one I have up here from Music Time. But if you go to the CD, there are several of these matrices separated out by activity and routine. And the white column is the situation. So you would find a situation that's similar to the situation you're dealing with in terms of a routine or an activity. And then each level of that hierarchy that we saw earlier is now flipped on its side, and the least intrusive is purple. The most intrusive is red. I don't know if you can read the words, but the purple is environment, the blue is schedule, the green is activity or routine, orange is materials, and red is requirements and instructions. So it's the same hierarchy. It's now just laying on its side, and these are adaptations to get you jump-started, to get you on the bicycle and to get you pedaling. It's not the answer, the end-all, be-all answer, but it is a starting point. The other starting point I want to introduce to you relates to Kara's Kit. This is another project that I worked on for many years with Pip Campbell. It's still active today. You can Google the Tatsu Tech website, and on that website there is a help desk. You see the big I button. The help desk is organized by activity and routine. It's also organized by functional skill area, and these are other examples of very basic, simple adaptations that can be made for very young children to address challenges with particular routines and activities. So this is another source that you can go to discover other ways that you can create adaptations. This is an example of the language section, and you can see a list of things here that you can click on, and it would take you to instructions on how to actually create the adaptation. So that's just a little aside, but it is related to the CARES kit and just another resource for you. So that's sort of a wrap up in terms of the structure of the CARES kit and what is in it and what is available. Now, the other thing that is in the kit on the CD, something that might be of interest to some of you, is a similar, these slides that have the border. Let me show you one. The bordered slides that have the footprints on them. Actually, on the CD in the CARES kit, there is a pre-packaged PowerPoint presentation that anyone is able to use to do a presentation for a staff meeting, an in-service, or your coworkers to introduce them to CARES kit. So that's a whole PowerPoint that's also on that CD in addition to the forms. And in addition to the PowerPoint, the forms, and the matrices, those are three big things on the CD. There's also an audio that you can listen to that will describe the CARES kit. So if you want a refresher, or if you want to use it to have people do it as sort of a preparation to come to a staff meeting and discuss CARES kits, you could ask people to listen to that audio in preparation for discussion. So there's several pieces of that CD that I want you to be aware of are there because most people, I don't know if they recognize that there's a lot of information on that CD. I'll just leave you with a few closing words that, again, CARES kit is not intended to be something that is picked up by one person and solved by one person in terms of the adaptation, but it's really a collaborative process, and we often find that families have very creative ideas to bring to the table as well as the professionals. So I would encourage you to use CARES kit in a collaborative fashion. And then I want to leave a few minutes. I think we have about maybe 8 or 9, 10 minutes, something like that, for questions. And Barbara, I'm going to let you facilitate how to do that. Maybe we do it through the chat, or I'm not sure. So I'm going to let you facilitate that.
Yes, I'd like to use the chat box. So if anyone has any questions, they can type them in there. So let's see what we can get going here. I really like your example about the Matchbox car. That was very clever and impressive that it worked so well.
Yeah, we were thoroughly pleased with that. The teacher for this little preschooler tried everything to get a crayon in this child's hand, and he just was not interested and kept going back to the Matchbox car. And it spiraled into, some unacceptable behaviors, probably on both parties' parts. And when we took advantage of his interest, then, it was really striking to see how he was able to extend his repertoire of thinking about how he could interact with the world around him. It was really fascinating to watch, actually. And it didn't happen overnight, but that's why I say you need to really take 1 to 2 weeks to kind of see the impact in some cases about adaptation. I think that's chat.
Yeah, I don't see any either. I'm just thinking also that the time, it does take some time. So being patient with whatever you're implementing to see if it will work, because it may not catch on that first couple of days, but if you give it a little more time, you'll get what you had intended.
That's right. And in some cases we do see an immediate effect. I was called in to do an observation of a child in the classroom one time. This was probably an older toddler. They were concerned about this child not eating and not consuming enough throughout the day in terms of, food and liquids. And I went in and it was lunchtime. I went in and kind of sat in the corner, tried to be a fly on the wall, and just watched what happened. And here what I came to discover and what we finally addressed was it really had nothing to do with the child's ability to eat. He was, no problems really with that. What it was is the whole setup of how he was positioned at the table. So most of his food ended up either on the table or on the floor, which they were seeing was an avoidance behavior that he didn't want to eat, when indeed he just needed. We grabbed a block, one of the big cardboard blocks out of the block corner. I took some non-slip shelf liner out of the teacher's desk drawer, which she wasn't too happy about at the time, but we put that on his chair, and we put the box under his feet, and we stuck a little rolled up towel behind his back, and he sat up to the table and he ate just fine. So sometimes when we think something's going on, if we can step back and use this approach by saying, is there anything we can do to the environment to change? Is there any equipment that we can introduce? And we stopped right there once we saw that he was then able to sit at the table properly and have his meal just like the other children. He just didn't have the core body strength in his trunk to hold himself up, and therefore he was unable to get the food from the table to his mouth in a way that didn't spill all over the place. So anyway, short stories, but I think we've seen a tremendous amount of success using adaptation. I don't see anything in the chat room, so I would say that, hopefully we've introduced you to a way, in a very intentional way, of planning and thinking about adaptations, and that you will choose to take this on as maybe a new challenge. And please reach out to me. I actually see now, Barb, that I don't have my contact on here, but I'm sure that there's some way we can get to all the individuals on this call my contact information.
Yes, I will send that when I send the recording. I'll send your email address.
That'd be great. And for those of you on the call who might want to jot it down, it's very simple. It's my first name, Suzanne, at UDEL, University of Delaware, UDEL.edu. And you can Google me and probably find it as well. So thank you, and thank you, Barb, for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to present about Kara's Kit.
Well, it was great. Suzanne, thanks so much for a really great session, and I want to thank the audience for hanging in with us, even if it was the sound might not have been so great. It sounded good to me, so we'll see what happens with the recording. I'll be following up with you all on Monday about today's session and sending the recording. If any of you have missed a session and you've got the recording and you've watched it now and you want to get a certificate of attendance, you can let me know. I've been monitoring that and trying to keep up with it. If you have any other questions or comments about the series, please let me know your thoughts. It's been great. This is the 5th in the series, and I know that I have enjoyed listening to all the presenters. So enjoy the rest of your day, and happy Thanksgiving all.